All right, so Brian Steed is a native Utahn with degrees from Utah State and Indiana University in Bloomington. Brian is an expert in natural resources and environmental law with extraordinary experience in the real world. He was the executive director of the Utah Department of Natural Resources, a co-chair of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, and he currently serves as executive director of the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air at Utah State University. In his free time, Dr. Steed acts as the first Great Salt Lake Commissioner, a responsibility that he started in May of this year. As commissioner, he is responsible to the quarterback of the state's Great Salt Lake Rescue Team. We are so lucky to hear from him today about challenges and opportunities surrounding the lake. Let's welcome Brian with a round of applause.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I'm sorry for getting here a little late. I had the full BYU experience this morning. I was struggling. I got here super early, right? I got here with 40 minutes to spare, no parking. And I didn't realize that there was a spot that was open that was reserved for y'all that I could have taken at any time and just didn't because I'm stupid. But anyways, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm going to actually combine two presentations today, just so you know why it's a little disjointed. And the reason being is because yesterday I presented at Envision Utah, and they really wanted to hear a broader overview of kind of challenges and opportunities on water. I'm going to start with that and kind of frame kind of the challenges that we have as a state. First of all, let's talk about this, and we're going to go outside of the state, and I'm even going to say very cleverly that this is outside of the state. What is that city? And this is in 1853. You got nothing? What do you got?
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles? That's really good. Have you seen this before? I'm so impressed. I've asked this, I don't know, probably 100 times before. You're the only person that's ever identified Los Angeles. So I'm going to call that inspirational right here for me. This is my dissertation. So back in the day, I was a student at Indiana University. I worked with a lady by the name of Eleanor Ostrom. She told me that I should go work on Los Angeles water issues, and I thought that would be just horrible. And I'm not wrong about that. It is horrible, but it's an interesting story. And so historian H.H. Bancroft notes, and this is in 1888 that he makes this great observation. By the year 1801, the population of Los Angeles had increased to 300 people. Less than half being adults, and adequate water supply during the long dry summers appears to have been one of the major problems. Okay, that's in 1801. So what happened? And the answer is this. Then in 1858, that building right there, do you see this building? That is a water storage tank, and the first storage tank that they did in the Los Angeles area. And that provided some ability to guarantee when flows were coming, because the mighty Los Angeles, you can see, is not that big of a river. And interestingly enough, that they then would have amazing flows and then very little flows and then amazing flows, but there was no security in how much water they can get delivered. So there was this human engineering component when that happened. And everyone said, who? And I could go forward on the story here and say, yep, it wasn't just this. They didn't end there. They then started major water importation schemes. They diverted the entirety of the Owens. Well, first of all, they diverted a bunch of groundwater. Started pumping groundwater like crazy about the turn of the century. Then they diverted the Owens River, brought the whole Owens River into Los Angeles. That ended up not being enough. And so they diverted a large portion of the Colorado River, which then led to the Colorado River, the law of the river and all that. And that happens in the mid 1930s. By eventually the 1950s, they're still kind of running out of water. And so they decide, well, then we're going to go in and say, how are we going to fix this? And they started a whole new water project called the California Water Project, where they diverted a bunch of water from Northern California and they flow it through big canals to Southern California. And by the modern era, well, that's still not enough, because there is all sorts of other complications and challenges and demands on that river. There was a time that everyone felt totally okay with diverting entire rivers or large portions of rivers, and whatever the consequences might be, so be it. That's changed now. And so over the years, they've had to adapt, right? And now they're pushing desalination as well as water reuse reclamation as part of the grand solution. The point being, though, is that water security was the key to facilitating that type of growth. Now, I'm not saying here that we don't want to be, that we want to be Los Angeles, because I don't think that Utah really does want to be Los Angeles. And who here is from Los Angeles? Are you from Los Angeles? You just know about this. Yeah. Right. Know everything about it, including the historical photos. Random places. So there's this thing, but water security is really important. When I talk about water security in the context of Utah, interestingly, we've had a very similar background to what California has. When Mormon pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, they decided, you know what we need to do is make sure that we have an adequate supply of water for farming. So they diverted City Creek on one of the first days in the valley, and then they have done a bunch of water engineering in the time since, including in the Los Angeles model, going after a big portion of the Colorado, bringing it over through the Central Utah Project, which is a lot of what your water that you drink here happens to come from that area, which you would have thought. Water security still matters. And when we talk to political leaders in the state of Utah, that is their concern, right? When you look at what that means though for us, well, it's complicated because we have some real water security challenges, and those water security challenges are manyfold. And I want to talk about some of those today, but I'll focus mostly on the Great Salt Lake because quite candidly, I think it's going to be the most compelling story. Let's talk about growth, first of all, in the state of Utah. Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah says that we're going to have large growth into the future. They've been right about this in the past. When you look at where that growth is occurring, much of it occurs right here in Utah County. In fact, 5 counties are projected to have in coming decades an additional 100,000 people in each of those counties. That's an interesting bullet point. And you'll see that the places the biggest growth, Utah County first, Salt Lake County second, and then Washington County third, and then you go into the other counties of the area. And I know that many of you aren't from Utah, but just be aware that growth is projected to be coming. Why that's concerning for us is, well, when I look at the water portfolio, and this is research we've done at Utah State, we have a changing climate, and that water portfolio predicts something that's a little different. First of all, we see that precipitation has been a slight decline. Now, when I run this over the entirety of the Great Salt Lake Basin, I can tell you it is not statistically significant. That's just what we've seen on precipitation. We don't see that. From 1950 to 2020, there is a slight decline, but when you run it over the totality of the time frame, not as much. Now, that being said, though, when you look at average temperatures have increased. And this was actually would include if we went into the summer months as well, but I'm going to focus on winter only right here because from a water security issue, this becomes interesting. Because as you have increased temperatures in those months between January and March, what do you see in terms of the type of precipitation that falls? It turns out much of that precipitation comes in the form of rain and not snow. And so when I was a kid and when I would hear things like it's going to rain in November, that would be really odd. If when I was a kid and they said it was going to rain in December, it would be even more odd still. I grew up in Cache County, which is the eternal north, and it's very cold all the time. In fact, I can tell you when I grew up, there was a winter and this is anecdotal. This is it's not scientific, but it's just take it for what it will, or you will. I had a winter where it hadn't been above freezing for so long. When it hit 40 degrees, I was out in shorts and a t-shirt because it was like summertime, right? It felt so good. But you look at this, okay? Interestingly, though, when you look at what that means for more rain, less snow, snow has been a de facto storage system for water in the state forever. We haven't needed to build a bunch of storage facilities, in part because we've had the controlled release out of snowpack. If that precipitation is coming in the form of rain and not snow, we are actually not able to capture much of that precipitation in the way that we have historically captured precipitation. And that's something that makes policymakers nervous. Probably not nervous enough, but policymakers nervous. So then we have environmental challenges, and this is just an overtime picture of the Great Salt Lake. Starting in really the high water years of the 1980s and going into where we saw the lowest water we've ever seen on the Great Salt Lake since pioneers started taking records. And as you watch that graph spin, this is made by our friends at Google, Earth Engine, you might notice that there is this kind of a scary trend, right? And moreover, I would say, I'll point out some things on the Great Salt Lake. What you see on the Great Salt Lake is a lake that has been used in lots of different ways. First of all, you might notice two different colors. You see that? And there's a line, a dividing line right here. Do you guys know where that is? In 1959, the Union Pacific Railway, beforehand, when they met in the Transcontinental Railway, they actually had diverted entirely around the Great Salt Lake. They'd gone up over Promontory Point, and that's why they met at Promontory Point. Years after that, Union Pacific said, wouldn't it be a lot more efficient if we could just go across the lake? And so they built a trestle bridge across the lake. Wood, salt water, not a great combination. And so after many years of repairing that trestle bridge over and over again, in the 1950s, they decided, hey, let's have a more permanent solution. And we're going to build a permeable, they intended to be permeable, a permeable causeway across the lake. So they built this big causeway across the lake in 1959. It turns out the causeway was by far less permeable than predicted. And so they've created essentially two bodies of water, a north arm and a south arm. The north arm actually oftentimes has different coloration. It has different coloration because it has different salinity content. There are times of the year the north arm becomes so saline, in fact, it turns a bright pink color because the only thing that lives in that water are halophiles that love the salt, and they turn out to be kind of pink in color, which is really interesting. Second thing I'll just point out just generally is that you notice that there's a lot of development around the lake. See these? You guys know what those are? They're mineral companies, yeah. So we'll call them mining operations. So this right here is US Magnesium, and then they actually have a Morton and a Brigham. This is Morton, but they have a variety of other Cargill, right? If you've ever used Cargill salt for a water softener, chances are that's where it was developed. They've got this very interesting facility out there. As well as some of the most refined table salts that's available. It has a unique structure. They're very proud of this Cargill are, and they're selling it as a unique flavor table salt. I don't know why.
Go Utah.
So, yeah. Salt is salt, okay? But nonetheless, this right up here is Compass Minerals. It used to be Great Salt Lake Mineral Companies. Compass Minerals produces, by and large, sulfate of potash. Sulfate of potash is very important fertilizer for California, by and large, for fruits and nuts. It's almost entirely exported. They also produce mag chloride, which is something you put on dirt to make sure that it keeps in place. And then their most recent endeavor would have been lithium. There's a lot of lithium in the Great Salt Lake. They have put their lithium project on hold currently, but just be aware that that's out there and that's something. Then lastly, we talk about US Magnesium. Oh, that right there over there, you see that one as it dries out. That's also Compass. And interestingly, because of the chemistry of it, they're able to put a deep brine trench all the way across the lake. Because of the density of the salinity, they can actually move water from that side of the lake to that side of the lake in this deep brine trench, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. US Mag, the sole remaining provider of magnesium in the Western Hemisphere. Actually, for those that pay attention to geopolitics, they are the only producer of magnesium in the NATO-aligned countries. Magnesium is a really important thing. They are not currently producing magnesium metal. Their refinery broke a little bit ago, and so they are mostly doing mag chloride and other chemicals. And then some people are probably refining that into magnesium, but it's interesting. Nonetheless, it becomes an interesting part of the story. With that, I'm going to switch up. We're going to go to a separate. I know this is super. I've never done this before in public, so this is very exciting. This is what happens when you run out of time to park. Okay, so similarly, okay, let's do this. Okay, you got that? How do we kill this thing? Display settings. I got it.
I can switch it to.
Wait, I can do that. I got it. We got
Got it.
this.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I understand. That's what happens when you go to endless amounts of school. No. Same graph, just not over time running. You can see the problem. You can also see the different colorations of the lake. And back here, you can see this big. Second thing I'll just point out real fast here. As we've seen at drying lake, you see different problems that arise and different complications. And we're going to talk about that a little more today. And so let's talk about where we go. Okay. So all those things have in common. What do they have in common? I just gave you the answer to this. They all come from the Great Salt Lake. The aluminum cans, okay. To be very fair, the aluminum doesn't come there. But magnesium is used as a hardener in that an alloy to the aluminum, and as a result, that's what gives it hard, that ability to hold it. Otherwise, it would be too thin. Cell phone batteries for lithium, magnesium for obviously defense and other stuff, and then sulfate of potash for fruits and nuts. And then we didn't talk about brine shrimp. Okay, those are not brine shrimp. Those are actually table shrimp, but those are shrimp that have actually been fed on brine shrimp, because if you've had farmed shrimp, which much of our shrimp is farmed, it has been fed on cysts that have come from the Great Salt Lake brine shrimp. Fun, right? Who would have thought? So all of you, whether you know it or not, who here has ever been in the Great Salt Lake? A lot of you, great. Whoever has ever eaten part of the Great Salt Lake? Yeah, I have too, actually, not by choice. Even if you haven't, if you've consumed a fruit or a nut or a shrimp in the last 10 years, chances are you have consumed part of the Great Salt Lake, which I think is really interesting. Okay, so moving right along then, but I think what most of us are concerned about is ecological vitality, right? This is, I want to see how good you guys are. We got Los Angeles, right? Can you do this one? What's the verb?
Goal.
It is a goal, great, nicely done, come on. Yes. You were so close before. Yeah, it is in fact the California goal. And why I have this up here as the California goal, that is the state bird. We are the only state I know of that has a state bird named after another state. And oddly enough, the California goal, despite giving all the fame to California, breeds in larger quantities in Utah than it does in California. Those jerks, I blame you. Yeah. Nonetheless, what you notice in here is not perhaps the bird itself, but all of this. What do you see there? If you've ever had an occasion to be at the Great Salt Lake at the right time of year, boy, it's a pleasure. Because you're going to be consuming part of the Great Salt Lake as well from the flies that you'll be consuming, and they're delicious. And they're not only good for people, it turns out they're really good for migratory waterfowl and as well as other birds that nest around the area. It becomes an incredibly important area. So those are in fact brine shrimp. That is not to scale. Brine shrimp are very small. Okay. But there turns out to be a really increasingly important Pacific flyway, but also a place where just other birds can live. This bird right here, you know what that is, Mr. California? Oh, look at that. So the Wilson's Fowler up, that's right. And then this is the eared grebes, right? Eared grebes, important because they migrate through Wilson's Fowler Oak because about 80% of its remaining habitat is around Great Salt Lake. You're killing it today. Boy, you want a job? Because I'm looking for people with answers. And so other things that the lake does, and I'm probably telling you things that you probably already know, but the lake has an important component of lake effect snow. Between 5 and 10% of snowpack that ends up on the Wasatch Mountains happens to be from lake effect snow. Smaller lake, we predict has a smaller lake effect, and that's a problem. And interestingly, we pride ourselves on our snow in Utah. And even if you don't have, if you're not a skier, to lose 5 to 10% of your snowpack would be pretty amazingly bad for water supplies consistently. And so that's something that also we're concerned about, right? The ski industry itself is also huge, but just be aware. But then we also have this interesting problem as the lake is dried out. You have more exposed lake bed. That more exposed lake bed then allows the lake to weather, or the bed to weather. The lake itself has a pretty natural salt crust on it. You know, that mag chloride that you put on roads to keep it down, it actually does pretty well naturally. But if it remains dry for too long, it does what dry things do, and that's blow away. And in this case, it does. And that's incredibly problematic for us here on the Wasatch Front and other places because we already have impaired air. we have a very unique physical constraint here in the area. And so when you have winds come across the western or from prevailing from that area over the Great Salt Lake, you end up with big dust events that you wouldn't have otherwise. And in fact, dust itself is something that people are concerned about. The Utah Office of Legislative Auditor General just this past 2 months ago actually came out with this finding that said, hey, if we're going to mitigate this dust without getting more water on it, if we're going to mitigate it, they predict it to be at a minimum of 1.5 billion capital costs with an annual maintenance cost of 15 million. Utah is a medium-sized state. Economically, it's a medium-sized state population-wise as well. That's still a big chunk of change. And looking at that, that gives people some pause. So the question is, why is the Great Salt Lake falling? Well, we have a pretty good answer on this. I indicated this earlier. This is work from the Great Salt Lake Strike Team. Precipitation. This is what I'm saying. If you take it back over time, you actually do see more troughs. These troughs right here, we call them droughts, right? And we do see more of those in the modern era, and that's something that'd be alarming. Again, though, there is a lot of variability, a lot of noise on the system itself, so it's not statistically significant, but nonetheless, be aware that that's something. The second issue, though, so we have prolonged drought in some cases. We have this little guy right here, which is that increased temperature. Think about this: as you put heat on water, what happens to water? It evaporates, and that's what we're seeing on the Great Salt Lake as well. And then you see stream flow revenues or stream flows incoming. That's the Bear River, which is the largest, to be over 50% of the water coming into the Great Salt Lake Basin would be Bear River. You see that declining. If we were to put up Jordan River, if we were to put up Weaver River, which did two major inflows, you would also see a similar trend line. Although a little less so on the Jordan River, because the Jordan River gets all that great Colorado River water that we're talking about. Okay, why do you think that's falling? I'm curious. It's a fair question. Why do you think it's falling? What do you think? I'm gonna argue that's probably the biggest factor. Now, I would also say this: is you have hotter and drier conditions and less snowpack, you have drier soil. Drier soil means when you get the irregular amount of snow, you might have less actual runoff. I'll give you a for instance on that. In the Colorado Basin, 2 years ago, they had about 85+% of snowpack, which is pretty good for that year. When the snow melt came, they got about 35% snow melt. The rest is really very dry soils, and so you didn't get the runoff that people expected. Anyways, so that's probably part of it, but I would say, seeing that it's this long-term trend, the reality is that's probably more to do with this. So that's human diversions, or sorry, that's human depletions, right? So let's get our terms right. Depletions is the amount of water that doesn't make it back in the system after you diverted it, right? So it's used in your crops, it's used in a variety of things, it's evaporated or whatever else. When you look at those trend lines over time, the largest depleter of water is farms and ranches. Agriculture, second largest would be municipal and industrial. And then the third largest, which I think is fascinating, and actually when you trend this out even for this year, it almost takes over this. That's water you divert to wetlands to keep them wet. As the water is receded off those wetlands, it actually takes more water to put on wetlands to keep them wet. Wetlands are incredibly important. And they actually have a big constituency of people that care about them too. Duck hunters, as well as just nature enthusiasts, generally do care about it. And so you say we should be doing this, but interestingly, just take more water to keep them wet. And then this yellow line right here, that's depletions out of mineral companies, right? You have those big evaporative ponds. They pump water out of the main body of the lake to get more concentrated minerals and making more sense. And then you just have some evaporative losses off of those areas, storage areas, so reservoirs. Good news. I think we had a great water year this year. We're saved, right? Yes. The answer is yes. No. It was a great water year, but the bad news is this: one good water year does not trend make, as well as the fact that none of those things that have driven that loss of water over time have changed, which means that indeed we're going to have to be more mindful of how we use water going forward. We're going to have to be more intentional if we're going to keep the Great Salt Lake wet, and I would tell you there's probably a lot of value for all of us to do that. And with that, let me go one more thing. Do you guys know why I chose these two birds? What do you guys think? What do you think? These are cool looking, I agree with that, good. And they're not from California, right? Good. Okay. Why these two birds? There's a lot of them here, good, what do you think?
Isn't that because Great Salt Lake's like a rescue point? And they're like,
That's also true. So I work on the policy end. I would argue these two birds present the biggest policy threat to the Great Salt Lake. We put the snow and plover up as well, probably, to be honest. Those two birds, because what happens is the Great Salt Lake is so important to their very survival. If the Great Salt Lake shows to be imperiled, we will have a regulatory action from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for listing these birds as threatened or endangered. And if that happens, what we've seen in other watersheds, that then kind of puts all of your water rights on its head, and we'd have to figure out what then we do to get more water in the lake. It's something from a policy option. Utah's a very conservative state, and people shake their fists at the federal government and say, feds. But here's the thing, if the lake continues to decline and we have salinity problems like we saw last year, we're gonna have a problem with bird species, and that's something we just gotta be aware of and probably mitigate against to make sure that we don't have that. So you should all care about these birds, even if you don't. The second thing I would say is this, dust is something also that is regulated by the federal government, which means that, hey, if we don't get it right, we will likely have a regulatory environment here in the state imposed upon us by the federal government. And that's through the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act regulates both PM10 and PM2.5, which is this different size of particles. Both are bad for you. The dust in the Great Salt Lake may be especially bad for you just because it's got a lot of those heavy metals in the dust itself, simply because it's collected all those things on its course to the lake bed itself. So it's something we're watching very closely. And so there's a lot of good policy reasons, not just that we care about the environment, but a lot of policy reasons, even if you don't care about the environment that much, to care about the lake. So just so we know. Okay, and with that, I'm gonna switch back to the other one because they're prettier slides. All right. If we can. I might be able to. I might. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Oh, dang it. So close. Let's see. I don't have my glasses on one moment. It was so smooth before. Oh, yes. Okay, great. So here's the good news. Okay. We do have some policy options to get more water in the lake. And I want to talk about those for the remainder of my time, and then I'd love to take questions and answers from y'all. Is that okay? How much time do we have? Am I out of time? What time do we have till? Okay. Oh, that's easy. I'll wrap up before that. Some of the policy options we can look at. As I mentioned before, agriculture is the largest depleter. There's good reasons why agriculture is the largest depleter, by the way. They were here first. Water rights in the Western United States are appropriated by first in time, first in right. And then as long as you're putting that to beneficial use, which agriculture has long been considered beneficial use, you're able to keep those rights. For those that practice agriculture, who here comes from a farm or a ranch? How do you guys feel about your water rights? Strongly, right? It's like your birth rights, right? Because of BYU, this is, I mean, anyone that comes and asks you for your water, you're Jacob looking at a mess of pottage, right? And I think not, Esau, right? But you're willing to offer Esau as much mess of pottage as you can, right? You don't want to give up that birthright. And so from an agricultural standpoint, there is this really strong emotional connection. Is that fair? Okay, because this is your lifeblood. So just be aware of that. But we don't have to kill ag. We don't have to kill ag. And that's part of the story that I think that we'd like to tell, is that there are better ways to do things. And there are various things that actually can divert less water. Okay, and let's be clear about this. Divert less water. And let's make sure that we keep those in streams, right? Then you actually deplete less water on the system as well. Okay, and some of those ways that we can do that are as follows. There can be just straight up fallowing, right? And I know it's BYU, but I would say we call that the F word in our policy circles. Because when you say fallowing to a farmer, that's not something that's very popular. Is that fair?
Fair.
Right? Getting paid not to work. Well, it sounds great for me. Farmers have a different work ethic and they say, hey, that we're not so much interested. So that becomes something that's very problematic. So what we're talking about here probably is more seasonal leases or split season leases. Seasonal leases meaning that we would go out and pay a farmer or a rancher to lay off for a season. We have a lot of alfalfa grown here. Alfalfa it depends on where you grow up, between a 5 and 7 years replant cycle, where oftentimes they'll tear it up and replant it just based on that. If we were to say every 5 to 7 years, hey, listen, let's just lay off a year, we'll pay you not to farm. We'll pay you as if you did have crops in the ground, but you don't have crops in the ground. That's by far better for the local environment, because then you don't have buy and dry effects, right? Buy and dry, you buy the water rights and people go out of business, and it becomes a lot of source of dust as well. You've seen that a lot in the Imperial Valley, California, and other places. So we can do that, or to say, I will pay a farmer or a rancher to say, you normally get 4 cuts of alfalfa, I will pay you to get 3 cuts of alfalfa, I'll pay you for the 4th, and you just don't put the water on, right? And that's something you can do. That's obviously has the most efficient way to get it, but then you look at other things you can do. You can reduce tilling. Reduced tilling requires less water. You're actually, those that have done this, talking to a farmer in the Bear River area just a month or so ago, started to adopt this practice where they're not tilling in crops, and he has a huge reduction in the amount of water that he's putting on his crops. And he's still growing the same crops. It's a little harder to plant, and he acknowledges that. But that reduction in tillage, and he's actually a corn guy, but that reduction in tillage has actually saved a ton of water application for him, and he was happy about that. Other things you could do is you could do flood to pivot, so that reduces, you actually end up, and I said efficient, I didn't define what efficient is. This is cost per acre inch, okay? So an acre inch is an inch of water over an acre. But if you do that, there's by far less labor costs in that. There actually can be less applied water. Now, one caveat on that, if you then take whatever saved water you have and expand production, or you take whatever water you've saved and it stays in the canal and goes to the next user, right? Now we're just getting more water used in the system. You don't have those savings, so we're gonna have to work with farmers to make sure that we have that savings in tow. But another thing that we can look at, and then you go down that list and there's just different ways. Low energy precision application, that's on an existing pivot. You change how that's applied. You change it from a high pressure system to a low pressure system. You have less misting, right? That's good. And then we can go down those other things for a variety of things. The good news is this, hey, you can actually save up to 15% of water, 15% reduction of water in that amount of water we use on agriculture. That's actually a substantial water savings, and we would be able to make a lot of difference in getting water to the lake. That's good. And then if you would add into that seasonal or split season component, or even just fallowing, although we don't say it, you can actually get more water savings as well. And so that's some good news. And interestingly, this is thousands acre feet on the side. Think about this. If I were to say we need to get, so the lake level elevation up, right now we're about 4192. It actually gets into a better system about 4195. If I were to say we can get all that water to the lake, that 200 acre feet per year, or I'm sorry, 200,000 acre feet per year to the lake, that actually gets us to that 4195 within about 10 years, that's good news, right? It's better for the lake, it's better for the salinity, etc. The other thing we need to do is this, we need to make sure that on municipal and industrial uses that we are not then taking whatever water we save in agriculture and applying it to our growing cities and towns. The good news is there's ways to do this as well. The majority of water we use in the municipal and industrial setting is used in outdoor settings, meaning that they put it on lawns and gardens. And if we just reduce those lawns and gardens and how it's applied, in fact, we can actually have a big water savings. And so one of the things we've been trying to incentivize as a state is reduction of turf. So there's buybacks incentives for turf. as well as trying to push more restrictive codes and covenants as we get into future growth to make sure that that new growth is also by far more water wise than past growth has been. It's something we're having a limited amount of success on. We will continue pushing it going forward. In Utah, people don't like being told what to do, but in understanding the value of that and meaning that they will be they then are able to continue growing rather than putting a moratorium on growth like the city of Oakley did last year in Utah because they didn't have any water. That's something that they can look at. So we're looking to get closer to water neutral growth. Good news, just honestly, is even if you look at the existing outdoor water use that we've got, if you look at how people actually apply water versus how much water is needed, there's a big delta there. And if we're able to get the word out on how people can apply water better, you can have the amount of grass you even have now and still have by far more water savings if you just are smarter on your application. Interestingly, I was talking to someone from the Weaver Basin Water Conservancy District. They had a park strip, true story, a park strip. And that park strip is the area of grass between sidewalk and road that was receiving 700 acres or 700 inches of water per year. You'd be growing rice by far better under those conditions. And guess what? The grass looked like crap. And why did it look like crap? Because it was overwatered. And so just being aware that's part of it. And then lastly, we got to make sure that when we get that water saved, that we can take that water back to the places that we need it. I'm a partisan as with the Great Salt Lake. Of course, I want to take that saved water and shepherd it into the Great Salt Lake and get more water there for long-term water savings and benefits. But think about this, you could actually do that. You could actually grow smarter. And you can still have agriculture, which is the trifecta, right? It's a win-win-win. Now, is that going to be easy? It is not, okay? But I would just argue this. With dedicated, intentional, smart, and persistent policies, we can actually get there. And we can get there in a way that's not entirely painful. And that gives me a lot of hope because my job is sometimes kind of hard as the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, because I'm always telling people, yeah, that's not such a good idea. Yeah, probably shouldn't do that. Yeah, no, we're not going to do that anymore. But if we're able to say, hey, these are the things we can do, and these are the way we can get there, that actually gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And I do think we have a bright future. And with that, I'll take any questions you got.
So I went to the Utah Farm Bureau Federation meeting a couple weeks ago.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And one guy in Weber County, farmer, got up, walked up to the microphone, and he said, "I was in a meeting the other day with the so-called commissioner of the Great Salt Lake, and his plan is to take 30% of ag's water and dump it on the Great Salt Lake." And he said, "I'm against using any ag water and converting it to salt water." Now, obviously, there's kind of been this.
Glad I'm the so-called commissioner, by the way.
So, congratulations.
Thank you. I've been so-called many other things.
And I guess, obviously there's been kind of this long-standing ideology that any water that makes it to the lake is wasted water. And I think a lot of these farmers are on board with the idea of anything in ag optimization, making themselves more efficient. But how confident are you that you can get a lot of farmers on board with water leasing, kind of a market-based water leasing system? And do you think that that really is a long-term solution, or is it just to get us out of crisis in the short term?
Well, if ag has a future at all, I think it has to be a long-term solution. I mean, and I would say, listen, we've seen areas that have gotten this wrong. And what I say to my friends in the farming and ranching community that I talk to all the time, and they're not bad people. Let's be very clear on this. They're people that are trying to make a living and they're trying to do what's right. And I would argue that all of us at some point were a product of agriculture. All of us still rely on the food that agriculture produces. So I want to be very clear that I want to treat ag as the enemy, but I have to have ag as part of the solution. There is some resistance, okay? But here's the thing, if we continue on the pathway we're on, we're gonna end up with an endangered species listing. And that endangered species listing, when that's happened in other places, the Klamath being my favorite example, the Klamath farmers and ranchers I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think they have 500,000 acre feet of rights. They're consistently getting delivered about 30,000 acre feet of rights. Because the rest is going to fish flows, right? Those farmers and ranchers are selling like crazy. If they can't make a business of that, right? So I don't want to be Dr. Doom. I don't want a guy that be bringing the pain, but people have to understand there are trade-offs to the options we got ahead of us, right? And yes, we can get the last drop of water out of agriculture, and that's something we can do. If we do that without remembering that the Great Salt Lake is this big body of water that needs some water too, we do so at our own peril. Farmers and ranchers do that at their peril. And that's something I think that we have to work with them on. The last part of the question, I do think that there is benefit to having that more market-based incentive. Farmers and ranchers are excellent at commodities. They have not been considering water as a commodity to date, except for when they're doing the ultimate sale, which is where they're selling it to the home builder by and large in the modern era, right? If they perceive this to be one of the various commodities that you can sell during a year, water has a lot of value. Water may be the most effective crop you produce. Does that make sense? But maybe that's because I teach economics. I don't know. Maybe I'm poisoned that way. I don't know, but I hope so. Yeah.
So a large part of the Bear River is in Idaho and Wyoming.
Yep.
Are you working with those states, those farmers and ranchers? Because they may not care about Great Salt.
They 100% don't care about Great Salt Lake. But I would say this, that's in part because the Bear River Compact, so that's the agreement between the states, says that they can't care about the Great Salt Lake. The Bear River ends before it goes into the Great Salt Lake, for the compact perspective, right? So when you talk about that, they're like, well, this is just a question of water rights, and water rights are. The problem is this, that whether it's a federal action on endangered species or a federal action on clean air, in either of those cases, generally speaking, those court rulings will go across state lines. And as they go across state lines, farmers and ranchers in Wyoming and Idaho definitely have to care. So one of the things that we are doing is trying to work very closely with folks there. We don't want to make it sound like we're coming to grab their water, because as soon as that happens, people are like, those are fighting words. But if they understand that they also have to be part of the solution, there's been a little better. We have not gotten very far down that pathway yet, but I can say it's been something we've been approaching. I'm part of my statutory responsibility is to come up with the strategy. The strategy is not public yet, but I can say that's something that we really need to do, and that's something we call that in the strategy is something we need to be better at. So does that make sense?
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Hey, by the way, I appreciate the IU hats.
Oh, yeah.
You just don't see it.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's where I got my PhD. Nice. Okay, what other questions? Nothing? Go ahead.
Is there any movement legislatively to maybe switch to more efficient crops, like alfalfa is kind of a notorious heavy requirement, there are other crops that we could grow that. Then that's not, I'm saying that, and I realize also that there's other things besides water. That not every crop belongs in every place.
Yeah.
But is there any thought of that?
So there is an active conversation about that. So I'll give you just for instance, if I had every alfalfa farmer switch to winter wheat from alfalfa, it's about a 50% reduction in water use. And actually about the same amount of price on current market value. Problem is with winter wheat right now, though, is there is no place to sell it. Right. And so even in a place where we could grow it, there's not a market to buy it. Because it's hard to get it to market from where we are now. All of our granaries, not all, the vast majority of our granaries are out of it. And so this is a by far bigger macro problem that would have to get back into that as well. There are other different crops you could grow, or alfalfa substitutes that would still be marketable. Nothing has reached that economic payout yet. So that's something I think that we really does require more research and more effort on our parts. Yeah.
So I hear as well that we ship out some of the alfalfa to other countries.
Mhm.
Is there any legislation being worked on to maybe consider other countries buying it from a more water populous area?
So it's an interesting question. I get it a lot, and I'm not entirely sure how to answer it. You've already driven 2 people out of the room, just by asking the question. It's just the affects the question. I don't know. So here's the thing. Facebook has a big data center here in the state. Facebook uses a ton of water on that. No one ever asked the question, well, why do we allow Facebook to operate? Why do we allow them to export their electrons? Right?
I have a question.
Okay. Part of the problem is as well, and I'll let Brigham respond, there are prohibitions against regulating commerce at the state level. And whether that's to another state or internationally, there have been a variety of court rulings to say that that's not a great idea. And so that's something that probably keeps people from doing that. Now, do I think that we should be selling a lot of our hay overseas? No, I do not. Because I think that ultimately we are essentially just exporting our water. And water is extraordinarily valuable commodity right now. But it's probably from a policy perspective, much harder to do. And when you think about all the other things we use for water and we don't care about that, because you could have asked the Facebook question, you didn't, right? And you didn't ask the Facebook question, and I'm not singling you out because nobody cares, right? That's just part of it, which is weird, right? But we do care about the alfalfa, and so that's something I think that we got to figure that out.
Yeah, I think talking about it would be useful because
Yeah.
I don't hear about that.
Yeah, right. Yes, sir.
So I just recently moved this year from the land of 10,000 lakes to this, land, I guess, one Great Salt Lake.
But it is great.
One thing that I noticed was how much water is being used by homeowners.
Mhm.
And they're making sure that the grass
Yep.
have water and all that. And we focus so much on the agricultural piece, but is there going to be any significant, are there any significant policies in place or specific policies that will help, that will significantly influence the amount of water that's going to be used based on consumers, like all of us,
Yeah.
use of water?
So the answer is it's coming. We are a very conservative state in Utah. People are not being told what to do, and that trickles all the way down to your city councils. So there are 2 things that we've been pushing. One, a few years back, we pushed for a tiered pricing system. Everyone needs water. We know that. Everyone needs water to live, right? So you should have a base amount of water that should be relatively cheap, because otherwise you're killing people, right? But there's a certain amount of water that gets to be kind of exorbitant, right? And as you go up that ladder, it should be more expensive, right, on the water. And so we've been pushing that. That is state statute right now to where you have tiered water. In truth, many of the applications of that have not been super aggressive, in part because we have this direct feedback loop called politics. And the direct feedback loop in this case, interestingly, so I was in the city of Layton, Utah, when they increased their tiered water structure. I was working as the head of the Department of Natural Resources. And I got a phone call from my wife, who was despondent, saying, how come we're getting charged so much for our water? Right? Because we switched that on, right? What my wife said was by far more benign than what the other people Layton called their city council people to say as well, right? Now, interestingly, they had the policy backbone to say, no, this is the right thing to do, and we're gonna keep at it, right? That has not been the case. The other places, interestingly, even South Salt Lake, which is very democratic, ran a bill 2 years ago to do away with tiered pricing because a particular person had an English garden that was lovely, that used a ton of water, right? And that person had contacted their legislator, say this is not fair. And so there was legislation that ran to do away with that. We beat that back. We were like, yeah, that's the whole point. We want them to be paying a lot for that. But it's interesting because that direct feedback is important. So here's the thing. I don't know where you're all gonna live. Regardless of where you live, you'll have water issues. Be intentional on how you use water, because that's important. 1, 2, it's gonna take by far more education to get people there. I'm hopeful. When you look at where we were 3 years ago versus where we are now. We've actually seen a huge decrease in outdoor water use. Which is surprising, I know. And if we're able to continue on those trend lines, I think that gives me a lot of hope. It's a long answer to a short question, sorry.
There's a question from online about what should we be asking of our legislators and what are the most meaningful ways for citizens like us to get involved?
So I think in terms of asking of your legislators, I would say to make sure that we're doing sufficient work to make sure that we have conservation as part of our core value set. There's a tendency to, when it becomes less crisis oriented, to take your foot off the accelerator, and unfortunately we don't have the ability to do that. Okay, so that's one. In terms of how we get more personally involved, I would say you got to be aware and you've got to be engaged. It's been my experience that politicos and even appointed people like myself do listen to people when they come to complain or come to just talk about some issues. And so the more of that feedback that you can give, I think is helpful.
So I would make another suggestion is, and something that we're working here at BYU is Neil Hansen, I don't know if Neil's in the room, but Neil and I are working on lots of solutions, and you can touch on many of them, but one of them is just switching out the type of grass that we use. We did a study this summer with hybrid Bermuda grass, which is currently listed as a noxious weed. You can't grow it anywhere but down in Washington County, but we went 6 weeks with no irrigation and that grass was still green. Would be just one example of one innovation. Now we recently met with the weed board, trying to get them to change the listing. And so, you know, if we want to get we need a little push from, because it's the common Bermuda grass truly is a noxious weed, but hybrid Bermuda grass, it was what we're using is not. So anyway, I think just getting innovations, scientific innovations, and you know, I think I'm very against. I lived in Phoenix. I don't want to live there again. I don't like having a rock lawn. We want plants, but we got to find better ways to do it. So
well, and interestingly, there's different types, even Kentucky bluegrass, that are by far less water. They're far less thirsty, so that's something to learn. Thank you so much.
That was awesome.